Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Scouten, who will be talking to you about Not Sure How to React. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC17. After this webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Ryan in the questions window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now, I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Ryan Scouten. Hello, Ryan.
Hello, everyone. Good to have you here. All right, let's get started on what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about how to deal and interact with React.js. All right, so now we have how we're going to react with SharePoint. A little bit about me. My name is Ryan Scouten. I am the Utah SharePoint User Group President. I have been working with SharePoint for over 10 years now. Before that, I was an ASP.NET developer working in and out of SharePoint over the years. The company I work for is called Zact. We're a SharePoint Office 365 consulting company based out of Utah, USA. And so if it deals with Office 365 or SharePoint customizations, making it work, we deal with it. But what we care about today is we're here to talk about React. First thing, though, is we need to level set. Who is this webinar for? The primary audience that we're looking for is essentially a developer that is familiar with SharePoint. We're not going to be covering what SharePoint is and how we interact with SharePoint itself. So if you're not familiar with SharePoint, you may get a little lost at places. Also, with what we're going to be dealing with, React.js is based in JavaScript. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript, there may be some time frames where you may get lost because we will be getting into some code. And also, if you're here, because you probably have some sort of interest in React.js. Now, getting started with React.js, this is one of those new areas that's been kind of interesting that we push for client-side development methodologies. In the last few years, Office 365 and SharePoint has taken a drastic change in mindsets about, okay, how do we deal with this client-side rendering? Especially in a cloud-first world, we can't run our server-side code in the Office 365 environment and maintain and guarantee that the environment is going to be able to scale and perform well. Far too many developers doing far too many things. Honestly, I've deployed some code that wasn't the best for the environment, but if we had that across 10 different people sharing one tenant, that could be catastrophic. So as part of this, we're dealing with different ways of implementing our functionality and getting our applications out to the users. Now, one of the things that's also been nice is within the last year, there was the release of the SharePoint framework. With that, Microsoft helps a lot of developers, me included, change our mindsets from, okay, well, we're just going to be doing JavaScript hacking, kind of putting some things into the page and using jQuery, and we're done. And also, even further back, getting away from server-side code and full build tools. So what we're going to be dealing with is we have a new tooling chain, essentially, that we're going to be interacting with. So we're going to be using a lot of just standard open source tools that a lot of web developers nowadays understand. We're going to be using Gulp as our build process. You're going to need, if you want to start working with this on your own, you're going to need to install Node.js. System.js handles a lot of our module loading. Webpack will do our bundling. And then what the code we're going to be looking at today is going to be written in TypeScript. You don't need to freak out. Oh, what's TypeScript? TypeScript is just a way of being able to add some type safety to your JavaScript. So that's all really we're getting into. Most of what we're going to be looking at is pretty much just basic JavaScript with some validations in place for us to make our code more reliable. Now, what we're going to be dealing with as well is we can use essentially any code editor that you want. Now, does that mean that I can do all of my development in Notepad? Answer is sure, if you really want to. If you're a glutton for punishment, that is an option. There's nothing that's going to stop you from doing that. But it's not going to be the best experience. So I know a lot of developers, they go out there, and I personally will be using Visual Studio Code for our demos today. I know there's some others that interact with Atom and Sublime and a bunch of other text editors out there. But in reality, all you really need is something that will allow you to be able to edit your source files. All right, enough of the basics. Getting into React. So the key areas that we have to deal with are about React. So a lot of developers out there that have started embracing client-side development started out working with Angular or something else. So personally, when I started out, I was using Angular. So I'm going to be relating a lot of the development and some of these changes in relation to how that compares to Angular, and primarily AngularJS, so Angular version 1. Now, a lot of what we need to deal with, we have some key areas. In React, we are building components. Now, a component is a reusable piece of functionality that allows us to be able to say, kind of like a web part is in SharePoint. We're going to be also talking about how React handles things, in that React is a little different than a lot of the methodologies out there. So say, for example, jQuery. When you're interacting with jQuery on the page, if you need to change the display of something, it will just, you go out, find the element, and make your modification. So in that instance, we're talking you are mutating the components and the markup on the page. In React, they don't mutate anything. They re-render. So if you make a change to your backend data store or your sources, and you want that to be presented to the users, it will re-render all the pertinent places that it needs to. And the reason it does that is for speed. By just re-rendering and dumping everything brand new out to the page, it can guarantee better rendering performance than if it had to try and go out and find everything and make those modifications. Also, React uses what they call a fast virtual DOM. So it's a virtual document object model, which is what a lot of the browsers understand. So we're dealing with a way that all of your changes are made in the virtual DOM, and then React pushes those changes out to the browser as updates happen. So that way it can be really quick and fast about making all those sort of modifications that you need for your application. So, as we were mentioning, for React components, they're small, reusable widgets of your application. A lot of what you're dealing with, one variation that you'll have with React and, say, for example, Angular, is that your UI, so your layout, and your logic are very tightly coupled. What that means is your HTML markup is actually part of your JavaScript code. I know when I first started working with React, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, I'm not too comfortable with this. I'd like the back to be able to pull things apart and separate the concerns. But there are a lot of tooling that we can do to validate and test our code that actually works better in this approach than the other way around. Now, we can create one massive component that has everything in it. So if you want to do a web part that has all of your HTML markup, all your interactions, all those sort of things in it, you can. But the ideal approach is to be able to pull out reusable components. And we're going to look about how we do that, just kind of some of the change in mindset that we need to interact with. But just keep in mind that the component is what we're going to be interacting with for the most part. Now, components have a couple different ways of dealing with data that we need to get into it or interact with. So in React, a component has state, which is how they interact, the data that it's going to be changing, and that will affect the presentation of your UI. There are also props, which is just a short for properties, that are passed into your component. So you can pass data in also, so you can have events passed into a child component that the parent can then pick up. Now, when we're getting started with it, working with React is fairly simple in concept. Once you get it down, it's pretty easy to understand. But when we're starting out, and we'll go through this in the demo, there are really only 2 React libraries that you need. And for the most part, as far as React is concerned, in all of my SharePoint development with React, these are the only 2. And they are React and React-DOM. So that's the biggest piece. Then also, as part of your component, every component has to have a render method, which the render is how you're telling React, this is how I want you to render the component that we're dealing with. Now, as we said, your UI layout and your UI logic are very tightly coupled. And the reason is React is using the concept of a JSX, or for us, since we're going to be using TypeScript, a TSX file. Really, it's just JavaScript and XML is what that stands for, or TypeScript and XML. But that's where we're going to be putting in our markup. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the markup that we're putting in there is and has to be XHTML compliant. That means you can't have any self-closing tags without the slash. So if you had an image tag, it has to be closed. So you have to have image with the slash in it. Otherwise, it won't be able to parse it. Also, React assumes that default HTML tags will all be lowercase. Your components, on the other hand, have to be mixed case. If you don't put it in as mixed case, it says, hey, whoa, wait a minute. This isn't a standard HTML component I know about. I don't know what to do with this. So keep that in mind as we're going forward. So let's switch over and take a look at setting up our first React component. So we'll go ahead and end the slideshow here. All right. Now, what we have is we have a completely basic Office 365 SharePoint site. In that site, I created a page that I called React Demo. So this is going to be what we're going to be putting our stuff onto. So to do this, we need to be able to load in our markup somehow. So keep in mind, this is what we're going to be coming back to. And then just to show you, open this one. Inside my site, I have a demo library, which is where all of our files and our assets that we're going to be generating are going to be deployed to. So inside here, we have a React bands, which is what we're going to be using for our examples today. Now, to get started, I have a project already in place. Let me bring it over here from the other window. Now, this is all in Visual Studio Code. We have some other things here that we'll be interacting with later, and we'll be dealing with that. But for the most part, really all we have to have is once we get our project set up, we have to have, based off of the open source tooling models that we talked about earlier, we need a package.json file. This will tell React and Webpack and all the tooling, here are the libraries that we're going to need to make sure this works, because this will use NPM, which is Node Package Manager, for pulling in all of our dependencies and the external libraries that we need. So we have some information here. We have the dependencies that we need that are going to be deployed out with our solution. And then there are some dev dependencies. So most of these we don't necessarily need. These is just code that's needed while we're developing. It doesn't need to be part of our production environment, but we do need it while we're there. So in here we have our React start TSX file. Now remember, TSX is for TypeScript. So some of the things we're going to look at are a little different than you'll see if you see some examples out there for React that are using JSX for just straight raw JavaScript. But this makes it a lot easier, and I'll show some examples and some benefits that we get with this in a bit. Now, as we mentioned, the first thing we need to do is we need to import two libraries. Those two libraries we need are, oops, got a space there, React and React DOM. So we just need to import React from React and import React DOM from React DOM. Now, why are there two different libraries? Well, for the most part, we really only need the React DOM library on our main, essentially the main component that we're dealing with, our first guy. That's the only one we need. Now, once we have that in place, we can, for example, go out and create some HTML. So I am going to create a constant. This is also one of those new JavaScript, ECMAScript 2016 type of concepts that also TypeScript uses as well. We're going to call this element. Now here's where things get a little tricky. I am just going to go and I am going to create and start typing in some markup. Oops, got an extra character there. So some of you may be saying, hey, whoa, wait a minute. I have HTML in my JavaScript. And the answer is, for the most part, yes. This is just a way of being able to create our components, and then we're off and we're ready to go. So we have everything here. We've got our element. Now I need to render this to the page somehow. And this is where React DOM comes into play. So in order to be able to render our element out, we need to call React. As you can see, beauty of TypeScript, I have autocomplete. Love it. So React DOM dot render. As we said, everything has to call render. And I am going to render out to the page our element that we created. Now, with React, we need to tell it where on the page we need to render it. So the nice part is with this setup, React works really well with other libraries and frameworks that you can use them in conjunction and they can work together because I can just target an item and then we're good to go. It'll deploy everything. Now, one of the other benefits of TypeScript is the ability for me to be able to see with the autocomplete what we have left. As you can see here, my line 8 has a nice red squiggly underneath it. Well, that is just because it's saying, hey, you're missing something. We need to be able to get this out. You need some more parameters. And it tells you what you need. So React DOM says, okay, well, we need our element and we need the container that we're putting it in. So to do that, we're just going to use straight JavaScript document.get element by ID. Thank you, autocomplete. And on our HTML file, let me show you this. We have a file called index.html. So in here, we have a div whose ID is main. Fairly simple. Now, we also load in React and React DOM. We're telling things that we're loading these externally, just so that way we don't increase the size of our bundle when we're creating things. Also, thanks to Webpack, and we'll get to that in a minute, it's bundling up all of our files and putting it into a bundle.js. So everything that it needs to run will be included as part of that bundle file. Makes it nice and easy, also using System.js to handle our module loading. So we know we have our div with an ID of main. So if I come back to our TSX, I can say, okay, we're going to get our element by ID, and I want main. And that's it. I'm going to actually got something running from tests earlier today. All right, now that that's in place, I can go ahead and save this file. But the trick is with these new tools, it's not as simple as just saying, okay, I want to save this file, and then we're good to go. I can copy things out. But also, since it's not that simple, we can also do some more cool things with it. as part of what we're interacting with, we are going to be using gulp to handle our build process. Why gulp? Well, that's what the SharePoint framework team just ended on for their build process, so we're just going to be consistent. So we use the same knowledge. Now, inside here, all this code will be available out on GitHub if you want to go take a look at it and play around with it. So I don't need to go into it too much, but we have some automated scripts in here. We have our Webpack that will build all of our code for us. We also have one of the cool things we can do is there's a task in here that is called watch. Watch, what it does is we can tell it, okay, I want you to watch this particular folder and these particular files, and if anything changes in them, I want you to do these actions. So in ours, if any of these files, when we run it, if any of them change, anything in our source folder changes, it's going to call out to our deploy task. Well, if we go down a little bit, is right here, which what this is doing is it's automating deploying those files out for us. So it will bundle everything up because it's calling our Webpack task, and then when that's done, it'll actually push these files out to SharePoint for us. I don't have to drag and drop. I don't have to make any of these changes. It pushes them out, and we're done. Most of the time, it is done pushing those files out to SharePoint before I can switch windows to be able to actually go look at it. So what we have is it's pushing those files out to our demo library and into the React-bands folder that we looked at previously. So we have that in place. So at the bottom of Visual Studio Code, I have a terminal window open. So I'm just going to start our watcher. So we type gulp watch, and that's it. We're saying, okay, go into gulp, run the watch task. And this will just sit there and run in the background. We don't have to worry anything about it. So if I come back down here and I hit enter, this will start up our gulp task. The first time it's a little slow getting started, but once it's done, we're good to go. But now as we can see, okay, starting watch and finished watch. Well, that didn't really do a whole lot. But it doesn't need to because we haven't told it to do anything yet. So if we close this file, remember, we told it to watch anything in the source folder. So our React start TSX file is in our source folder. So as soon as I save this file, this lower section down here is going to update. Says, oh, I've noticed you changed something. I'm going to package everything up, and I'm going to push it out for you. So I am going to come up here just visually just to show everybody that there's no trick. No magic going on here. I'm going to click Save. Now watch that bottom section. As we can see, it picks up, realizes, oh, okay, you made a change. I'm going to build it. Now, like I said, the first run is usually slower. This guy's taking its minute because it has to load up all the stuff. Okay, it's processed everything, and it's now pushed those files out to SharePoint. Yay! Now, just to show you that it is faster on a regular basis, we'll just come in here. We'll put a space on the end of this. This time I'm going to use the keyboard. Do Control S. It picks it up, and boom. Done. So if we now switch back over to our SharePoint site, and we go into our React bands folder, which is where we push things out, we'll see we have some files that were modified a few seconds ago. So we have our bundle.js, which is what we're working on for our first demo. And we also have index.html and SharePoint data was modified a few seconds ago because it just pushed all of our HTML files out. Yay! So we can also see modified by SharePoint app. The gulp task that I'm using that I set up is deploying these with an app-based permissions. So all of your developers don't have to put in their username, password into the script and then be able to, in order to be able to deploy it. It'll just run and deploy it. Also makes it really nice for continuous integration. So that way you can set up build and deployment tasks that it can automatically push these out as you're checking your code into your version control system as well. Really pretty nice. All right. So a lot of the basics there. If I switch back over to our React demo page, we need to be able to load our content into the site. So we need to be able to load our application. So the easiest way to do this, if we just go edit the page, granted we're still using some of the things we've been able to do for a while for client-side development, we are going to add a content editor web part. So go to our categories, media and content, content editor. Yay. So if we click add, we have our web part. Now, as part of this, we need to go in and edit. And I'm going to copy over the URL just so we don't have to type it, but just to show you, we're going into our demo folder, our demo library, the React bands folder, and we're going to pull up index.html. So we've looked at that guy before. Nothing fancy here. One of the things I also like to do, just because I don't like having the header there that says content editor, I'll come in here and set the Chrome type to none. All right, click OK, and then we save. All right, so now our code is loaded on the page. Let me open up a tools here window. Looks like I may have had an error. No. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, everything's loading. Okay, we've got an Office 365 error. Okay, it's not throwing any errors for me. This is interesting. Let's double check, make sure I actually saved that. Double check this real quick. Okay. Demo, React bands, index.html. Let's test our link here. Yeah, our link is good. Okay. Well, let's switch back to our code here. Okay, so we're going against main. Do a little live debugging here. We're loading in React bands bundle and React start. Now, one of the nice things, let's load up our sources. Make sure we've got everything pulled in here, and I'll bring this over here so everybody else can see as well. So what I'm looking at, we have the developer tools here, and our bundle is loaded. And as we can see, this thing is not too bad because we're not doing too much with it yet. But as far as I'm seeing, it doesn't look like our bundle is including our code. There's our problem. Okay, so if we'll double check that, our Webpack is using bundle, is using source React start. If I do this, okay, that should be all we need to do. Interesting. Well, I may have to come back to this demo. This was working a little bit ago. Let's terminate this. And let's do a manual. Gulp deploy. So this is the manual way of doing that without the watch. Just trying to make sure we get things updated. Let's pull this up. Okay, says it, built it. Output our file. So if we go out and check our bundle, oops.
Ryan, we have people here suggesting if you cleared the cache, would that help?
It's possible. Let me just double check to make sure actually the bundle generated what it should, which it looks like, yeah, the bundle is there, so we do have a caching problem. So let's go ahead and save this guy. Okay, Control F5. There we go. Thank you for that suggestion. Got a little flustered there for a second. Okay, so we have our hello world text. Yay, nothing super fancy. So we'll go ahead and put this back in watch mode, just so I don't have to watch it. All right, now what we can do with React, we've talked about we have the different pieces, but we need to be able to use components. So what we have is there is a component that I've created that is called Hello World, which really all it does is it does the same thing as we were doing. We have an H1 tag we're putting out there with a name that we're passing in. So as far as the React component is concerned, really all we need to do is import from React, and then we're going to export a default class. Now that's a newer way of JavaScript, ECMAScript, all that sort of stuff, TypeScript type thing. It essentially is saying, I am creating a class, and when you import it using one of these import statements, this is going to be the default, so I don't have to do the star as React. And then in here we have our render method, as we talked about earlier, and then I'm passing in a property that is going to be the name. Now, in React, in order to be able to export, to get out of XML mode, so like we said, it's going to treat this all as XML. To leave XML mode, we just use a single curly brace, and then we close it with another curly brace, and this tells React, oh, okay, this is no longer XML, this is actual JavaScript. So in here, we're just going to be outputting name. So if we go back to our React start, we take our not so fancy HTML, I'm going to import our component. So we go import hello world from, then we need to tell it where we're coming from. Since it's one of our own components and not a library that we've loaded in through npm, I need to tell it where it's coming. So if we're coming from our current folder, so /components/ hello, hello world. Now, when we're importing, we don't need the extension. We don't need the .tsx, the .js, those are things, because it automatically knows, okay, I know which types we're looking for, so we're good. As long as you don't get a squiggly, it says I was able to find our file. So now, what we can do is we can use our component. We use the same name that we called it here, so it's called hello world. So we can use autocomplete here. Yay, life is good. Now, because of the way our component is set up, we can stop right there. Our component is set up that if we do not pass in a property called name, it'll just use the default value world. And there are a couple different ways we can give it a default, but that's one way of doing it. So just to show that, if we save this now, that's right, it's first one, okay. Done. All right, so if we switch back, and this time do a Control F5, make sure we get everything out of cache. Okay, so we have hello world again. We can see we changed because now we're in an H1 tag. Nice and simple. But we want it to say something different because this is a component. We want to be able to reuse this. So we can pass in a property, which we've told it our property is called name. So I can say name equals PC. Oops. Webinar and ease. All right, we save. You can see in the terminal, it's picking up, everything's pushed out, life is good. Okay, refresh our page. And we have to make sure we do a Control F5. There we go. So now we have our component that says, hello ESPC webinar attendees. Woohoo! Now the nice part is, since we set this up as a component, we can actually reuse this again. So I can create another one and throw on here, hello world, name equals, you people are awesome. Different exclamations, and we must close our tag. Okay, that's everything's deployed, Control F5, and we now have both. So just because of the fact we've been able to put this in a component, we can reuse this as much as we want. Now, we can use this as part of this application, or we can take that exact same TSX file, put it in the library and use it in other applications, or just take that TSX and put it into another one, and we don't have to modify anything, and we're automatically up and running. All right, now let's switch back over to our slides. And we're going to talk about, like we talked about, properties and state. So we used the properties when we did our hello world component. So we need to use props to pass data in. Now, one thing to keep in mind, props are props are read-only. So whatever you're passing into them is a read-only value. You cannot go in and modify those properties. And actually in TypeScript, it'll give you errors and complain if you try to. So that doesn't work as well for us. So we've got state. State allows us to be able to use data that's changeable. So we can receive and we can work with the data. If we need some data, if we want an initial state, so we need to put in some default values, we can do that in our constructor method. Also, best practices do not modify the state directly. They provide a method called setState, which is how we can notify to React, hey, I've changed something here. Go update the UI. And when we call setState, the updates that we're making are merged into it. So if we're only updating one property on our state object, it only impacts that one. If we want to do more, we can just pass in more, and it just kind of merges the two changes together, and then life is good. Everybody's happy. So it makes it really nice that we say, okay, I just want to update this because that's all I care about, that's all I'm working on, and then React does what it needs to. Now, as far as the life cycle, when we're dealing with React. Now, we've talked about we have to have a render method. There are also some other methods that are beneficial to know about. As we mentioned, we have a constructor, which if you've dealt with server-side development and server-side languages, constructor is nothing new. But essentially, if you haven't, this is our way of being able to set up things initially. Now, best practices, don't load your external data here. Very tempting, but there are other methods that are more applicable. So, in particular, component did mount. This is where you can go in and set up, do some final setup before things get finally rendered. So this is the point where you can go in and call out to external services, so in our case, SharePoint, and pull in data and start interacting with it and set it into our state so things can start working. Now, there's also another handy one. There are several other ones, but mostly what we may need to know right now is there's a component will unmount. This is just kind of what you're saying, hey, if you have some stuff that you've stored in memory, some different events you've manually added to the page, this is how you can go in and clean those up. Now, dealing with DOM events, so regular standard on click, on mouse move, on change type, the standard HTML events. We need to add them to our markup. But now remember, what we're adding to our TSX file is not straight HTML. What we're passing in is then parsed by React and converted into JavaScript. And then that is, in turn, used to render the page. Now, events that we're going to be using, they have implemented most, I'd say almost all, but most of the HTML events. But we need to keep in mind, our events will need to be camel cased. So on click is not just on click all lowercase, it's just on capital C click. So on change, same thing. Also, when you're passing that in, you can pass in the function, as the event handler and not just a string like we do in standard HTML. Because in HTML we can pass in, okay, I want to do this. Well, in React we need to pass it in a function. So we can do an inline function, but it still has to be a function that is given to it. Now, conditional rendering. There are a lot of times where in React you need to be able to say, hey, I only want to show this element in these situations. Now, as we saw when we did our demo, we created our element and we just stored it as a variable. What we can do is, as part of your render method, you can look and if anything is in a situation where you don't want it to display, you can set that variable to null, and then it will not be rendered. Anything null, React says, oh, okay, well, I don't need to render this, and just ignores it, moves on. Also, you can do an inline if statement, as we have the syntax here, where we have our condition, so whatever our evaluation is, and then double ampersand, and then our element. So if that is the first expression evaluates to true, it'll output it. The third option we've got is the tertiary operator. Essentially, we're just passing in our condition, our true false, and then what we want to happen if it's true, followed by a colon, what we want to happen if it's false. So Yet again, you could return null instead of an element here, and then it won't render. All right. Now, lists of items. So there's a lot of times when we're interacting with things in SharePoint and React, we need to be able to take an array of data and we need to output it to the screen. Now, the nice part about React is we're not doing anything funky. So in Angular, for example, if you want to output an array of something, you have to do an ng repeat on your actual markup. Well, in React, it's just using JavaScript. We're using raw JavaScript. We're using a map method that is a method on the array object that allows you to iterate over every element in the array. Now, as part of that, we are passing in, we have here object.map. We're passing in an arrow function, as it's called, an anonymous function. We're saying, I am expecting a property called item. Now, we can pass in also the second parameter would be the index if we really need it. And then what we need is we have our function, so we have our curly braces, and then this is going to return whatever markup that we want it to return. So we can use our item object and pass it into different things, render an LI with different items we need, but it's fairly simple. Now, one of the things that when you do that, if you do not put a key element, a key attribute on your markup, React will put an error in the console and complain. It says, hey, I need this in order to be able to better render your markup. In case something changes, I know I can tie things up instead of just, okay, some things may have changed order and just have to re-render everything. So all you really have to do is put in a key equals whatever you want. Now, it just has to be unique, so React can manage it. Now, as we say here, keys must be unique among siblings, which essentially just means any of its children, other elements at the same level have to have different keys. Because it's, like I said, it's how React builds and renders things. Now, if we are going to be interacting and pulling data, so we're creating a form inside SharePoint, we're gathering data, what we need to do is there is an onChange event that we call when those inputs change and we can get those values back out. Then as we saw earlier, if we want to exit XML mode and actually use JavaScript again, we just put in a curly brace and that's how we can get our content out. Now, with React and SharePoint, as we saw, we're loading our external resources, so React DOM, in our HTML file. Then we then take that HTML file and load it into a content editor. Now, what we're going to be using is we're going to be using a library called SPPNP.js, which is an awesome library created by the Patterns and Practices community that allows us to be able to interact with the SharePoint REST services very simply. Now, do we have to use it? No, but it just makes things a little easier for us. So that's what we're going to be using today. Now, one of the things we have to talk about, we have to kind of change mindsets here. Now, in React, things are created top down. So here we have an example. We have our reusable components. Okay, we're going to be creating, as part of our next demo, we're going to be creating this functionality. Granted, we will change the header there because it's not part of SPFSDC. We have a new thing, but this is just a screenshot just to show you the concept. So we have our page here, but we need to kind of break this up into reusable components. So if we think about it, we have our main area. Okay, that is our application. So that can be our parent component. Then if we think again, okay, well, what other areas do we need? Okay, well, we have a component, which is where we're adding in a new band, hence the name of the demo, React Bands. So we can put in a new band, put in a new name, everything's good. And then we can add, okay, so we got that. And then we have our details component. And then we have a component that handles the rendering of our lists of items. And then, so for the most part, we're not really getting a whole lot of reuse here, but it does allow us to compartmentalize these pieces. Now, the next part we've got is we have our actual reuse here. These components will allow us to re-render each and every band out there without having to recreate the HTML and the logic every single time. All right, now let's go ahead and we'll go take a look at how we do this. So we have our current demo. if we switch back to this, we're going to change out, and instead of React Start and Hello World, we have a SharePoint Data TSX. So what we have here, we're not loading in anything that we haven't really seen before. What we are doing, though, is we are creating an interface to store our state. So this is where we're pulling in, okay, we're storing all the bands that we pull in. So we have a property on there that is called bands, and then we have a property called selected band. So this is when they click on a band so we know which details to show. Because keep in mind, all of the events and things we're dealing are with a top level item. So we need to make our changes to the parent and then pass it down. The changes filter down to our children. So in our constructor, as we talked about before, we need to make sure we call super, which if you've dealt with object-oriented languages before, this is essentially just saying, hey, go out and call the constructor, the parent, to get everything set up, and then do my custom things on top of that. So we're just setting up default state. Now we have a load band method that we are calling from component will mount. So we've talked about this guy previously. We're calling load bands, which is calling out to SharePoint service.get list items from our bands list. Just to look at that, we go out to our services folder, and I have a SharePoint service, which is just calling out to loading in the SharePoint PNP.js. So if I call get list items, we're calling PNP SP web, which essentially we're saying from the current site that we're in, on the lists, go get the list by the title that we're passing in, get the items, and then call get. So there's ways we can do filtering and sorting, but for what we need, we are just getting the items. Now, this will return to us a promise. As we can see here in the tooltip, it says, okay, this will return. It's passing a queryable method. Okay, cool. Then we have to see at the end, promise any. Promises are a way of being able to better handle asynchronous calls. So this, we call into this, it'll give us back a promise. Then in our code, we can do .then. So that's our way of saying, okay, when this completes, I want you to do this. So we're passing in the classic method where we're passing in a function. Now we could do an anonymous arrow function. Just change this out, take out the function, put in equals, greater than, and we're done. Woohoo! So it's just kind of a way of being able to handle that. Also, a concept to keep in mind is a lot of times when you're dealing with anonymous functions, you get a callback later. In that callback, the context of this can change. So this is this, except for and then this is not this, and then this is this. Really kind of a confusing thing about the way things are set up in JavaScript. But with bind, we can say, okay, when this method calls back, this really means the context. So this, our component, which is our way of being able to say, okay, I want to be able to call this method called setState, otherwise it will complain. And it says, I don't know what setState is, because it's in a different context. So once we get our bands back, we call setState for the property bands. So as you can see, we're only updating bands, we're not updating selected, and then we're passing in the data that we get back. Then we have some other methods. Now in our render method, because everything has to have render, I start out with the default value. Okay, our details, if they haven't selected details, it's just going to be a line feed. If they have, then we're going to render out our band detail component, passing in from our state the selected band. And then we have our band list component and our new band. So what we're going to do, this should already be deployed out to SharePoint. So if we switch back over, we're going to take our content editor and we're going to switch out and point it to the other HTML file. So we come in and edit, SharePoint data, HTML, click OK. Oh, and we have some caching going on. Let's refresh that again. There we go. So we have it. Granted, we still have the text, so we'll need to fix that. But we have all of our bands in here, everything set up. We can click, and things load. And granted, the delay here is because I have to go out and load these images. But so once we load a few of these up, we can go back and click, and things are pretty quick. We can also add in new ones, but as you see, we have these different components, and since we're using client-side, all the rendering is fast. Things just update. So if we come back over, I was like, okay, in our SharePoint data file, this is not that. We'll just call this webinar demo. So we have things there. We're pulling in the data. There's nothing fancy about these different components. All we're really doing, so for example, on our new band, is we're just outputting the controls. We have our onChange. We're calling out to the different methods to set up the variables, update the state. And then what we do is when they click the button that we have on there for add, we are just calling the submit method, which is here, which calls out to SharePoint service. Granted, yes, this is not the ideal approach because we're kind of doing all of our updates here instead of in the parent, but just to show you the concept, and then we're done. So nothing super challenging. Now, the trick though is we have our code, but our application just doesn't look all that pretty. Because we have dots, and we have some big nasty buttons. We don't have some things. Now, this is where the Office UI Fabric comes into play. So the Office UI Fabric is a way for us to be able to use front-end experiences, make our stuff look like SharePoint. So a lot of the out-of-the-box experiences inside SharePoint, Office 365 primarily, are using the Office UI Fabric. So a lot of the classes are already going to be there, and they're available to us. So we have different fonts that we can use, icons, color schemes. Now the cool thing that we're going to be using is we also have components. Yes, components, React components. We have controls that Microsoft has already created that we can use to make our stuff look exactly like theirs. So say, for example, you wanted to get the document card experience that everybody loves in OneDrive. We can take advantage of it and use those pieces as well. Now, as part of the fabric, the Office UI Fabric has the Office UI Fabric core, which is just the basic elements and styles and those sort of things. Now, we are going to be using the Fabric React, which has the components that allow us to be able to use those pieces. There are also different libraries for Fabric.js, which is just raw functionality, and then ngFabric if you're using AngularJS 1. Then there's also Fabric iOS if you want to start pulling in and using some of those experiences, make things look nice in a native iOS application. So, if you want more information on this, it's fairly easy. We can go out to dev.office.com/fabric. So some things we've got, if we look at styles, we can look at different icons, and there is a plethora. So if you're used to using web development, you may have heard some people used Font Awesome. This is kind of gives us a lot of the same things, but we're using the same ones that Microsoft is using. And so we can search for different things in here. So for our demo, I know that, okay, I want something that has to deal with music. Oh, sweet. So we've got some notes. So what we can see is they give us the setup, the markup that we need. So if we're just using the icon, we don't need any fancy controls or anything along those lines. So we just put on the class ms-icon, ms-icon --. This one says mail, but really it's whatever you're going to be, whichever icon you want to use. So if we want to use music note, in our situation, it'd be ms-icon --. music note. So let's go ahead and add one of those to our band list item. We want these guys to look fancier. Now, I have the markup already here in place, so I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it in front of our band name. Okay. Also, I want to kind of spruce up that add button, because as we saw before, our button here looks kind of plain. So what I want to do is I want to come in to our new band, and instead of our basic button, I'm going to take this one, take us out of XML mode, / to comment out, and back into XML. Okay, I'm swapping out one for the other. Oops. All right, now it is complaining. You should not be complaining. What are you complaining about? So let's go ahead and take these guys off, because back in XML mode, that's what it was. Okay. Oops. You are what's complaining. There we go. So now, if we save this one, granted, since I'm doing double duty here, it's going to deploy it twice. All right, we'll just save it, run twice. So now if we switch over to our file, Control F5, yay, we now have a fancier looking logo here, and yeah, granted we could use some CSS and remove the dot here just to make it a little better. And we also have our Add Band button, which looks a little nicer, kind of looks like one of the out-of-the-box SharePoint buttons. We didn't have to do anything for it, other than say we wanted to, just to make sure there's no smoke and mirrors here, new band. We need to import, since we're using one of their components, we're importing default button from Office UI Fabric React. Then in the library, we're saying I want from the button file. So now if we scroll down to use it, we pass in default button. We're telling it the icon we want, which is optional. I'm saying, hey, we're doing an add, so we'll do that. We'll do our text is add band. Now, we also need to tell it you can do just like a regular HTML button. We can tell it that it's a submit, or we can tell it it's a button. For our sake, we're not submitting anything, so I want this just to be button. Now, it can pass in an href, and it actually expects one to be there. So if you're going to be doing a method call, which we are doing, just pass in JavaScript : void, and it says, okay, click it, nothing happens. It won't go anywhere. But then it will still call our onClick event, which allows us to be able to now call out to our custom functionality. So we can just verify that. We can say, okay, ESPC, webinar, image URL. Where's my good one? This is the one I like. Okay, we'll call this one Techno Cool People for Webinar. And then we can click Add, and it adds, and we can click it, and we're off and running. So just to show you, the image does change, and we're good to go. All right, looks like we're winding down here. So at this point in time, just like to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. We have my contact information up here. If you have any other questions that you afterwards think about, oh, wait a minute, I need to ask this question, go ahead and feel free to contact me, reach out to me on Twitter. I'll also have my blog up there in case you want to reach out to me that way. And at this point in time, I'd like to turn it over for questions.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. That was absolutely super. Yeah, we have some questions in here. We're nearly out of time, so we'll be as quick as we can. First question, are there some best practices for where to load data from an external service if you pass them between different components?
If you're passing it between different components, the best practice is to load it into your parent component and then have your parent manage that thing and manage the data and pass it down to the children as necessary. So if you have a bunch of different places, you can take it and it will handle the communications. It's kind of the best practice for that one.
Okay. How was the URL of the React brand library set up in the project?
The URL for the React band. Okay, the React band project. The URL, let's go ahead and stop this. You're talking this URL?
I'm not 100% sure. This is what the person has asked. So they said, how was the URL of the React band library set up in project? Ooh,
okay, in the project. Maybe you're talking about the deployment of it. So in our gulp file, as part of the task that handles the deploy, so we have our deploy task, we're telling it, I'm pushing it out to our SharePoint, to my Office 365 site, and then in there, when we're actually pushing the files out, I'm saying, okay, put it into the demo library in the React bands folder. So the combination of the two is how it knows where to put the file.
Okay. One person asked, can you post links to the Git repository and possibly the video recording? Yes, I'll be posting a link of the video to everyone that's attended and missed it. And also, if you just want to send me on any links to include in that email, Ryan, I can do that if need be.
Yeah, we can do that as well.
Do you recommend using ES5 or ES6?
At the moment, I would say use ES5. Most of the time, like when I do my development, I do it in TypeScript, and so I don't really have to worry about ES5 or 6. And the reason is because TypeScript transpiles everything down to JavaScript. So it transpiles it. You can select whether you want it to be ES5 or ES6, but so it doesn't really matter too much which one you end up using. Most of the time, the ES6 is not fully supported in all the browsers. So in that scenario, you need to make sure you're putting it into a language that you're going to be supporting. So if you know everybody in your uses Chrome and the latest version of Chrome, you could stick with ES6 and be done. But otherwise, you kind of have to stick for ES5 for Internet Explorer and some of the other browsers.
Okay. Last two questions. Why are we bound to use Node if we're not even using the local workbench, only for npm packages?
Node is handling the packages, and it's also handling gulp. So gulp is being run through Node as well. Are we bound to it? Most of the tools and examples you're going to find out there are going to be based off of using Node. Really, Node is just kind of a command prompt tool that it's using. So when it knows that we're already running it, do we have to? You could probably find a way around it, but most of the things, it's going to be easier just to use it.
Okay, brilliant. Ryan, thanks so much for your time. I see you've also just put up your GitHub page there, so anyone that's interested can just type in the URL there and get to your code as well, your source code.
Yep, exactly. I figured pulled up so that we've got as part of the video as well. So if anybody needs to, all the samples that we've dealt with today, even the slides that we went through, will be up there on the repository.
Excellent. Ryan, thank you so much for taking part in our webinar today. Really appreciate it on behalf of all of the community here. Great to have you on board and do this today. Really good presentation.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Delighted to have you. Okay, thank you, Ryan. That's it for today, everybody. Hopefully you can join us again in our next webinar. Have a great day. Thank you and goodbye.